Visualize a being so perfect that God himself describes him as the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and beauty. His skin was not skin like ours. It was a living surface encrusted with 9 precious stones that reflected the light of God's throne as if he were a walking cathedral. Sardius, topaz, diamond, chrysolite, onyx, jasper, sapphire, carbuncle, and emerald, each stone pulsed with its own brilliance, as if it were breathing. And when he moved through the corridors of heaven, every step produced a musical sound, because an instrument had been placed inside of him. Literally, tambourines and flutes made not of wood or metal, but of the very substance of glory. He did not play music. He was music. And here is the question that no one answers correctly. If this being was so perfect, so enlightened, so close to the throne that he walked upon the holy fire of God himself, how is it possible that he fell? What happened inside that radiant being that caused him to trade heaven for the abyss? The answer is not where you think. And to understand this fall, first you must understand the scale of what was lost. Because what we call today the devil, Satan, the adversary, before the fall he had another name, a name that meant the one who carries the light, Lucifer. And his life in heaven, before everything went wrong, was something that even the most devout Christian can hardly imagine. Because when the Bible opens a crack and lets us peer at what Lucifer was like before the fall, what appears on the other side of that crack is something that defies any human reference. Ezekiel chapter 28 describes a creature that was in the Eden of God. Not the Eden of Adam and Eve, pay attention to that. The Eden of God. A place that existed before the Garden of Earth. A celestial garden where the trees did not bear common fruit. They bore light. A place where the ground was made of molten precious stones, as if you were walking on an ocean of liquid gems that never cooled. And in the middle of this cosmic garden, there was a figure, not just any angel, an anointed cherub. And a cherub, pay attention, is not a little baby with wings as Renaissance art painted it. A cherub, in the original Hebrew text, is one of the most fearsome creatures in the celestial pantheon. 4 faces, 4 wings, eyes all over its body moving like lightning. And Lucifer was not just a cherub, he was the anointed cherub who covers. That is to say, his wings stretched over the very throne of God, like a guardian positioned closer to the Most High than any other creature ever created. Think of the absurdity of that. Of all the billions of celestial beings, of all the seraphim, cherubim, archangels, thrones, dominions and powers, there was one who had the privilege of covering the throne with his own wings. Only one. And that one was Lucifer. But what did he do up there? What was the daily life of this being like? Here, things get even more impressive, because the Bible, when read carefully, leaves clues that Lucifer was the maestro of celestial worship. In Ezekiel 28 verse 13, the text explicitly speaks of the tambourines and pipes prepared inside him on the day he was created. This is not a cheap metaphor. Hebrew scholars understand this verse as a literal description that Lucifer was created with musical instruments incorporated into his very being. He didn't need a harp, he was the harp. When he inhaled, a note came out. When he moved, a chord was formed. When he raised his voice in praise before the throne, the entire heaven stopped to listen. And imagine the scene for a second. You are in Job chapter 38, where God asks Job, "Where were you when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" These morning stars, according to many interpreters, are exactly the angelic beings from the beginning, and right in the center of that choir, conducting everything, was Lucifer. His name, in Hebrew Hillel ben Shachar, means shining sun of the dawn, and in Latin Lucifer means light bearer. He carried the light that illuminated the praise of the entire universe, each star singing its note, each galaxy resonating at a specific frequency, and Lucifer coordinating that cosmic symphony like a conductor whose baton was made of pure lightning. If this level of glory impresses you, Leave a like now so this video can reach more people who need to understand what was lost there. Because now comes a detail that will shock you. Lucifer didn't live in just any part of heaven. The text of Ezekiel says he was on the holy mountain of God and that he walked in the midst of the stones of fire. These stones of fire, according to ancient traditions, were living coals that exist before the throne of the Most High, the same type of coal that a seraphim later took with tongs and touched to the lips of the prophet Isaiah. That coal that purified Isaiah was so spiritually hot that a seraphim needed tongs to handle it. And Lucifer? Lucifer walked in the midst of them, barefoot, so to speak, without burning. Because he was made of the same holy matter, he had access to what theologians call the immediate presence of God, a level of proximity that even the seraphim, who cover their own faces with their wings because they cannot endure the direct glory, could not bear without protection. Think about that. The seraphim, beings of pure fire, need to cover their faces before God, but Lucifer, before the fall, saw the face, without a veil, without a filter, without burning. He was so deep within the glory that the glory was already part of his body. That is why he shone. It wasn't an external aura, it was internal light coming out through the gems that lined his celestial body. And if you believe that God creates each being with a unique purpose, comment, everything has a purpose. Because this next piece of information will force you to rethink everything you thought you knew about the devil. Lucifer was not created evil. The Bible is crystal clear on this point. Ezekiel 28 verse 15 says in plain words, "You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you." Perfect. This word in Hebrew is tamim, and it means complete, upright, without any fault. He came from the hands of God in a condition of absolute perfection. No childhood trauma, no original sin, nothing that could corrupt his character. God made Lucifer beautiful, wise, and perfect. And yet, at some point in the midst of all that glory, something began to break inside. But before we get to the break, let's linger a little longer on the glory, because you need to understand the dimension of what he had. The Hebrew word used to describe Lucifer's wisdom is chokmah, the same word used to describe the wisdom of God himself and the practical wisdom that builds the universe. Lucifer had this wisdom in a superlative degree. He understood the inner workings of cosmic laws. He knew how light separates from darkness, how time flows, how gravity keeps the stars in orbit, how music affects the structure of reality. He was, in essence, a cosmic scientist and a celestial artist at the same time, two gifts that in the modern human almost never appear together. And here enters a grounded speculation that several commentators raise. Some scholars believe that Lucifer had a governing function over one of the three great angelic divisions. If there are myriads of angels organized in hierarchies, and Daniel, Revelation, and Colossians suggest there are, then someone governs those hierarchies under the authority of God. And many understand that Lucifer was one of those governors, an angelic prince, a regent of the morning whose jurisdiction extended over an unimaginable portion of pre-human creation. He was not just any employee of heaven. He was almost a viceroy. And that word, viceroy, is important. Keep it in mind because it explains much of what will come later. Imagine his routine now. If the word routine even makes sense in a place outside of time. Lucifer would rise, if there was indeed a morning in heaven, and many theologians say there was a rhythm of praise equivalent to morning and afternoon. And his first action was to conduct the song of the hosts. Billions of angelic voices aligning under his baton. The choir would begin with a single note, like a low hum of the universe, and would gain complexity until it became a symphony of such harmonic richness that the stars themselves vibrated in sync. That which we call the music of the spheres, which the philosopher Pythagoras intuited millennia later, Lucifer conducted that daily before the throne. After the morning song, He fulfilled duties of proximity to the throne. The text says that he covered. And covering, in the context of the Hebrew tabernacle, was the function of the hammered gold cherubim that stood over the Ark of the Covenant, with their wings stretched over the mercy seat. The Ark of the Covenant on earth was a copy, a reflection of something that existed in heaven. And the original of that scene, the cherub who covered the celestial mercy seat with his own wings, was Lucifer. He was, therefore, inches away from the Shekinah, from the manifested glory, closer than any other being in creation, closer than the 4 living creatures of Revelation, closer than the 24 elders, closer than Michael, closer than Gabriel. Can you imagine what it means in terms of privilege to be so close to the source of all life that you feel the Creator's breath on your own wings, that you hear every decree before it is executed, that you witness firsthand every creative act of the Most High? Lucifer saw galaxies being born. He saw God separate light from darkness in the first creation. He saw the angels being created one by one in successive waves, each new host coming out of the divine thought like sparks coming off an anvil. And he was there, witnessing everything, learning everything, absorbing wisdom directly from the source. But solving the problem of access created deep down a silent danger. Because when you have unlimited access to the glory of God, 2 things can happen. First, you become humbler every day because you see how great he is and how small any creature is before him. Second, you begin to confuse the glory you reflect with the glory that is yours. You start looking at those 9 precious stones on your chest, and instead of remembering that they were set there by the sovereign decision of the Creator, you start thinking they are part of your essence, that you are beautiful in yourself, that the light coming out of you is your property, not alone. And here is the most disturbing detail of this entire story. The Bible does not say that Lucifer became ugly before he fell. He fell beautiful, he fell wise, he fell powerful. His corruption was invisible on the outside, on the inside, in the motives, in the intentions. It was devastating. And this means that for an indeterminate time, he continued conducting the celestial choir, continued covering the throne, continued walking among the stones of fire, while inside, a thought grew like a fine crack in a seemingly solid wall. But before we enter that crack, you need to see a dimension of his life in heaven that practically no one comments on. Lucifer had a name. And in biblical terms, a name is authority, it is function, it is identity. God gives a name to what he creates, and each name carries a mission. The name Hillel, the one who shines, meant that he reflected light. His function was to illuminate. He was like a cosmic lighthouse whose task was to cast God's light onto other creatures so they could see and worship the Most High. He was a means through which glory reached distant places, a conduit, a channel. And that is where the subtle danger of being a channel lies. Because when water passes through a pipe for long enough, the pipe starts to think the water belongs to it. And this is the silent drama of the creature closest to God. For centuries, perhaps for entire eons, because time in heaven does not run like ours, Lucifer perfectly fulfilled his function as a channel. He took the light from the throne and distributed it. He took the divine melody and amplified it. He took the wisdom of the Most High and translated it into executable decrees for the hosts under his authority. And none of that was sinful. On the contrary, it was exactly for that purpose that he had been created. The problem was not the function. It was the moment when the function began to feed an appetite that should never have existed. But before reaching that moment, let's zoom in even further on his life, because a detail that almost no preacher explores is Lucifer's relationship with the other angels. Think about it. If he was the anointed cherub, if he conducted the praise, if he governed an entire hierarchy, then billions of angelic beings saw him as a leader, not as an equal, as a superior. When a common angel needed celestial instructions, the one who coordinated those instructions was someone from Lucifer's hierarchy. When an order came down from the throne to a specific region of creation, it often passed through his wings before reaching its destination. He was, in practical terms, a kind of prime minister of heaven, and the other angels respected him with a reverence that bordered on admiration. Not idolatry. Holy angels do not idolize any creature, but a deep admiration, because that being was literally the closest to the throne. And Michael and Gabriel? Pay attention to this detail. Michael, whom the Bible would later call the archangel, one of the chief princes, the great prince who stands for the children of your people. Michael, at that time, did not have the prominence he has today in the biblical account. Gabriel, the divine messenger, also occupied a secondary position relative to Lucifer. Some interpreters, looking at Daniel 10 and Revelation 12, suggest that there were three great cherubim in the pre-cosmos: Lucifer, Michael, and Gabriel. And among the three, Lucifer was the first in honor, the first in wisdom, the first in proximity. And that, in itself, already creates a dangerous emotional brew for any creature that does not keep its heart anchored in absolute humility before the Creator. Because notice the subtlety of the spiritual risk. There is no sin in being the first among the created. There is no sin in being praised by God as the seal of perfection. There is no sin in conducting the praise of the universe. The sin was born the moment Lucifer, instead of returning all that glory to the source, began to retain a fraction of it for himself. A small fraction at first, a short thought, a half-second pause before his own reflection on a gold surface of the celestial temple. How beautiful I am. And that sentence, spoken inside him, was the first seed of a tree that would later cover the universe in shadow. But let me tell you something about that seed. It didn't sprout immediately. Lucifer's corruption was a process, not an event. Ezekiel 28 verse 17 uses a very strong expression in Hebrew. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. Look at the verb, corrupted. The Hebrew word here is shichet, which means to ruin, to progressively destroy, to deteriorate. It is not something that happened in the blink of an eye. It was a deterioration. Lucifer didn't wake up one day resolved to rebel against God. He was, gradually, over an indeterminate period, letting the contemplation of his own beauty poison his wisdom. Each extra look at his own reflection, each silent comparison with other beings, each thought like no one here is like me. And while this poison worked inside him, on the outside everything remained perfect. He continued leading the worship. He continued covering the throne. He continued walking among the stones of fire without burning. The other angels looked at him and saw no difference at all. God himself, in the mysterious economy of his patience, allowed this process to unfold without abruptly interrupting. Because God does not crush the freedom of the creature, he respects free will even in the most glorious being in heaven, and Lucifer chose, day after day, thought after thought, the direction that would lead him out. Comment now, freedom, because this is fundamental. If God had created Lucifer without free will, there would be no fall, but there would also be no genuine love nor true worship. The possibility of the fall was the price for the possibility of love. And Lucifer, with all his brilliance, with all his wisdom, with all his direct access to glory, chose to use his freedom to cultivate something that should never have existed inside him. But let us return to before that moment, to the dimension of his celestial life that we haven't finished exploring. The 9 materials that coated Lucifer's body, sardius, topaz, diamond, chrysolite, onyx, jasper, sapphire, carbuncle, and emerald, were not chosen by chance. Each of these stones, in ancient Hebrew symbolism, represented a spiritual virtue. Sardius represented the blood of redemption. Topaz represented steadfastness. Diamond represented indestructibility. Chrysolite represented the morning light. Onyx represented strength. Jasper represented faithfulness. Sapphire represented the sky, the throne. Carbuncle represented the fire of the spirit, and emerald represented eternal life. When God encrusted these 9 stones into Lucifer's body, it was as if he had decorated this cherub with the 9 highest medals in the universe. Each stone said to the universe, "This one is my favorite. This one carries my attributes. This one is a mirror of what I am." And think of the paradox. It is very interesting to observe that on the breastplate of the high priest of Israel, millennia later, God would command Moses to place 12 precious stones, 1 for each tribe. Just 12. In Lucifer there were 9 stones concentrated in a single being. The high priest represented an entire people before God. Lucifer, with his 9 stones, represented something that only God knew for sure. Perhaps he represented the very angelic capacity to mediate between creatures and the Creator. Perhaps it was a preview of the cosmic priestly office that existed even before the existence of men. In any case, those stones marked him as a being of a most holy office, at a level of consecration that even the archangels did not know. And there is still more. The Hebrew text of Ezekiel 28, verse 13, uses a very specific expression to describe how these stones were mounted. "The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared in you." The word translated as workmanship is meleketh, which means literally work, craft, art set in. Medieval rabbis, studying this verse, even compared Lucifer to a walking musical cathedral, a being whose very body was a living temple and whose breath was a hymn. Every movement of his released a frequency. Every thought of his, when aligned with the divine will, produced a harmony that reverberated through the cosmos. He was not just a being who sang. He was a being who existed musically. Music was his way of being. And now combine that with the fact that he conducted billions of beings. Imagine the spectacle. At a given moment of the celestial day, if day even makes sense, the song would begin. Lucifer would raise his voice, and the first note would come out of him with such purity that it tore through the silence of the cosmos like silver lightning. In response, the seraphim around the throne would enter with their voices of fire. Then the cherubim, then the thrones, then the dominions, the principalities, the powers, the virtues, each angelic choir adding its sonic layer, billions of voices intertwining into a single composition, and at the center of it all, conducting, leading, elevating, a cherub with 9 precious stones shining on his chest as if he were a private sun. Do you understand now what it means to have lost this? Do you understand why Lucifer's fall is not just a curious chapter of theology, but the greatest tragedy ever told? He had everything. He was everything a creature can be, and yet he chose to throw it away. And if you have followed this video until now, it is because you feel, deep inside you, that understanding this story changes the way we see life itself. Because if the most glorious being in heaven managed to fall, how many times a day do you and I run the risk of falling too, in smaller versions, but with the same root? Subscribe now, because in the next few minutes we are going to see how this fall began to take shape. But before that, there is still one last dimension of pre-fall glory that needs to be explored. Lucifer's access to the mind of God. This may sound strange, but follow the logic. God is omniscient, meaning he knows everything. But the angels, although they are not omniscient, have access to revelations that come directly from the throne. Gabriel, for example, was sent to reveal secrets of the future to Daniel. The angels know details of the divine plans. And if this applies to any angel, imagine it for Lucifer, the first in wisdom, the one who covered the throne, the one who heard every word before it was executed. Lucifer knew cosmic secrets that not even the highest archangels of today know. He knew, for example, of the existence of men before men were created. This is a disturbing detail. When God began to formulate the plan for the creation of humanity, Lucifer, because of the privileged position he occupied, witnessed that formulation. He saw God plan Adam, he saw God plan Eve, he saw God plan the earthly Garden of Eden as a reflection of the celestial Eden. And he saw something more. He saw that those human beings made of clay would receive something that no angel ever received: the direct breath of the Creator himself, the divine image and likeness, dominion over the earth, and the possibility of having children. Angels do not reproduce. They were all created at once, in a fixed number. But humans could generate more humans. Each human being would be a little God reflection, multiplying the image of the Most High in each generation. And many theologians point to this exact moment as the first tremor in Lucifer's heart. When he realized that God planned to create a race made of clay, a material infinitely inferior to the precious stones that coated his body, and give that race of clay privileges that surpassed angelic privileges in certain aspects, something inside him revolted. He saw there not just a creative act, but an act of favoritism. At least, that was how he began to interpret it. And interpretation is everything. God was not playing favorites. God was simply revealing the infinite multiplicity of his love, which creates different types of beings to love them in different ways. But Lucifer, beginning to look at his own reflection with eyes that were no longer totally pure, read that as a threat. And here arises an almost unbearable question. Did Lucifer, upon seeing the plan for humanity being drawn, begin to feel something like jealousy? Angels feel emotions. The biblical texts themselves describe angels rejoicing, angels worshipping, angels ministering with compassion. Emotions exist in heaven. And if Lucifer, in his original perfection, felt all the holy emotions in a superlative degree, joy, praise, reverence, zeal, then he also had the emotional capacity to, once corrupted, feel the dark versions of those emotions: jealousy, pride, resentment, contempt. And he began very slowly to develop each of these sensations while observing God's plan unfold. And yet, on the outside, everything remained the same. He continued to be the maestro. He continued to be the seal. He continued to be the cherub who covered. The external glory remained intact, while the internal glory consumed itself in silence, like a candle burning inside a glass lantern that no one suspected was going out. And this is where the next chapter of this story begins, the discovery of the crack, the moment when Lucifer himself became aware of what was happening inside him, and instead of repenting, chose to feed the crack instead of sealing it. But before going to that chapter, I want you to absorb one last layer of pre-fall glory. Lucifer was, in a sense, an anticipation. The early church fathers, like Origen and Jerome, speculated that the excessive beauty of this cherub had a pedagogical function in the cosmos. He was a model of what creation could achieve in terms of reflected glory. He showed all other beings how much God could beautify a creature when the creature remained totally surrendered to the Creator. Lucifer was living proof that holiness produces beauty, that proximity to God produces radiance, that perfect obedience produces wisdom on a cosmic level. He was the advance announcement of what all saints would one day be, only on an angelic scale. And that was perhaps his most sacred role, to be an example, to be a showcase, to be the first among the created brothers, the living model toward which all creatures would look and say, if he can be like that near God, so can we in our measure. But the moment Lucifer began to look at himself and see an autonomous destiny, he betrayed not only God, he betrayed all the billions of beings who held him as a reference. He broke the mirror. And when a cosmic mirror breaks, the fragments scatter across the entire universe, wounding anything that comes too close. Pay attention to what I'm going to say now, because it is perhaps the most impactful information of everything that has been said so far. Lucifer was created to glorify. The root of his entire being, the essence of his purpose, was to return to God the glory that emanated from him. When he sang, the intention was that each note would turn to the throne amplified by the choir of the universe. When he shone, the intention was that each ray of light coming out of the 9 precious stones would point back to the source of that light. He was a sacred boomerang. Everything that entered him had to go back to God. And that was his beauty. Not the static beauty of a statue, but the dynamic beauty of being who received infinite glory to return infinite glory. A perfect cosmic breath. Inhale from the throne, exhale to the throne, inhale, exhale, forever. The problem started exactly there, at the moment when Lucifer, in one of those breaths, held the air. He inhaled the glory of God, and instead of returning it entirely, he retained a tiny fraction, just a fraction, almost nothing. So little that not even he himself noticed at the first moment. But that fraction, once retained, began to accumulate. 1 day turned into 2, 2 turned into 7, 7 turned into 100, 100 turned into 1,000. And without anyone noticing, Lucifer was building a private treasure in his own chest, a stockpile of stolen glory that he was beginning to consider personal property. And when the creature begins to stockpile the Creator's glory, it is signing its own sentence, because stolen glory is like a coal hidden under a cloak. Sooner or later it burns the fabric, burns the skin, burns the soul. Lucifer didn't feel the heat yet. He thought, on the contrary, that this accumulated glory was making him more radiant, more powerful, more worthy. He looked at himself and saw an amplified brightness. But this brightness was no longer the healthy brightness of reflection. It was the feverish brightness of a spiritual infection beginning to manifest. A cosmic fever. The first signs that the highest creature in heaven was about to collapse from the highest height ever built. And it is exactly at this point that the story needs to stop for a second, so you can understand an important thing about how evil installs itself in a perfect creature. Evil never enters through the front door. It doesn't clap at the gate. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It doesn't arrive presenting itself as evil. If Lucifer had seen evil approaching him with monstrous features, he would have repelled it instantly. Any holy creature rejects evil when evil shows itself for what it is. The problem is that evil, especially at the cosmic level, comes dressed as good. It comes as logical thought. It comes as legitimate admiration of one's own beauty. It comes as innocent reflection on one's own position. Lucifer didn't hear a dark voice whispering rebel against God. He heard his own voice saying seemingly neutral phrases like, "I am really something very special." And it was in those seemingly neutral phrases that the poison infiltrated. Think with me. When a creature is made perfect, it has no reference of imperfection to use as a mirror. Lucifer had never seen sin. He had never witnessed a fall. He had never observed any being from heaven fall into error. He was the first. He was the guinea pig of free will at the maximum level. And perhaps that was precisely the danger. Without a history of previous corruption to study, without examples of other angels who had fallen before him and could serve as a warning, Lucifer navigated this territory alone. And when he began to notice something strange happening inside himself, he had no internal vocabulary to name it correctly. He didn't know the name of that sensation was pride. He didn't know that silent comparison with Michael and Gabriel was envy. He didn't know that restlessness upon seeing the plan for humanity was jealousy. All of that was new, completely unprecedented in the universe. And the most impressive and most tragic thing is that Lucifer, with all the wisdom God had given him, would have been able to name those sensations. His wisdom was immense. He could, if he stopped, recognize each of those nascent emotions as deviations. But to stop and recognize, he would have needed to do one thing that began to become increasingly difficult: look up instead of look in. And that is the mechanism. The fall of any creature, angelic or human, begins the moment it changes the direction of its gaze. While looking at God, Lucifer saw himself correctly. The moment he began to look at himself too frequently, he began to see himself distortedly, because the creature only sees itself accurately when it uses the Creator as a mirror. Outside of that, any reflection is deformed. And see the subtlety of this. Lucifer didn't stop worshipping, at least not all at once. He continued fulfilling his office. He continued conducting the choir. He continued intoning the songs. But each song gradually began to have a different tone, not a tone that the other angels could detect. The deviation was still too subterranean for that. It was an internal tone. When Lucifer sang, "Holy, holy, holy," his heart began to add an invisible word at the end of each repetition. Holy, 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 and me. No one heard that and me. But it existed. And every time it appeared, it strengthened the trail that would later become a highway. This is the nature of cosmic sin. It begins at the frontiers of thought, in regions so remote from consciousness that not even the creature itself can track the exact moment the line was crossed. And while all this was happening, heaven continued operating in apparent perfection. The angels ministered, the cherubim covered, the seraphim cried out. Creation developed in cycles of glory. Galaxies were formed, worlds were prepared, entire systems were born from the divine fiat. And in the middle of all this, Lucifer continued to be seen as the great, the first, the beautiful. Appearance did not betray him. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable lesson that the celestial pre-fall narrative gives us. A creature can be in an advanced process of internal corruption and, on the outside, remain glorious to all eyes around. External perfection can hide an internal ruin that not even the creature clearly sees. And only God, who reads hearts, knew exactly what was unfolding inside that chest encrusted with 9 precious stones. But think of the divine patience during this period. God knew. God saw every thought. God followed every fraction of glory unduly retained. And yet, God did not intervene immediately. Why? Because divine love does not coerce. Divine love gives space. Divine love allows the creature to reach the edge of the abyss and, there, have the chance to turn around. God waited. Cosmic day after day, he waited. Each worship from Lucifer was received by God with the same tenderness with which a father receives a son who doesn't yet know he is getting sick. God received the songs, accepted the office, and at the same time, in the silence of his omniscience, saw the heart of the cherub drifting away fiber by fiber. And he waited for the moment when Lucifer might realize and come back. Because as long as the creature has consciousness, it has the possibility of return. And here enters a very important theological detail. Some interpreters suggest that during this incubation period of the rebellion, God offered Lucifer multiple subtle opportunities for repentance, opportunities that didn't come in the form of public rebuke, because that would have humiliated the cherub before all of heaven and violated the dignity of free will, but in the form of intimate moments, pauses, silences, instants when Lucifer, alone before the presence of God, could have said, "Lord, there is something strange happening inside me. Help me." Those opportunities existed. They are part of the mysterious economy of grace, and each one of them was, one by one, despised. Lucifer, instead of speaking with God, spoke with himself. Instead of looking at the throne, he looked at his own wings. Instead of confessing the crack, he hid it. And hiding, in the spiritual realm, is the first step toward hardening. And here is where you need to stop for a second and absorb this truth for your own life, because this story is not a distant tale about a being who lived in a pre-human era. This story is a map of what happens to any creature that begins to retain glory unduly. You and I do this on small scales every day. When we receive a compliment, and instead of returning the honor to God, we keep it for ourselves. when we achieve a victory and, instead of recognizing the grace that sustained us, we attribute everything to our own merit. When we look in the mirror and, instead of thanking God for the body that was given, we start comparing it with other bodies, seeking superiority or inferiority. These small retentions of glory are, in miniature, the same mechanics that led Lucifer to the fall. The difference is of scale, not nature. That is why understanding Lucifer before the fall is so important. Not because he is a fascinating character of spiritual folklore, he is much more than that. He is the archetype of all creaturely sin. He is the first example of what happens when a being, no matter how glorious, decides it can live with a little piece of autonomy in relation to the Creator. And if such a fall happened to the most beautiful, the wisest, the one closest to the throne, then imagine how much we need to be vigilant in our infinitely more modest positions. If Lucifer fell surrounded by precious stones and the direct vision of God, what would make us think we are safe just because we are considered good people? Safety is not in being good. Safety is in keeping our gaze fixed on the Creator and returning to the narrative. In this period of silent gestation of the rebellion, Lucifer also began to experience something unprecedented: solitude. Notice the paradox. He was surrounded by billions of angels. He was in the constant presence of God. He conducted immense choirs, and yet a strange form of solitude began to sprout inside him, because the creature that separates itself internally from God also separates itself as a consequence from all celestial communion. The body was together, but the heart was beginning to live in a dimension apart. And this internal solitude, instead of alerting him to return, was interpreted by him as confirmation of his uniqueness. I am so unique that no one here completely understands me. I am so special that even the other cherubim are simpler than I am. Solitude, which could have humbled him and led him back to communion, was internally converted into an argument for even greater pride. And this is the cruel effect of incubated sin. It transforms every alarm signal into fuel for its own growth. God sent signs. Lucifer's conscience probably emitted alerts. Solitude could have functioned as an alarm clock, but the cherub, in an advanced process of internal hardening, interpreted everything backward. Each alert was read as validation. Each discomfort was translated as proof that he deserved an even greater position than the one he already occupied. And it was in this broth, in this silent fermentation of retained glory, reinterpreted solitude, permanent comparisons with Michael, Gabriel, and the humans themselves were yet to come, that the first catastrophic phrase began to be born in the basement of his soul. A phrase that Isaiah 14, verses 13 and 14, would record centuries later in literary form. A phrase that begins with two seemingly innocent words, but which, pronounced by a creature, are equivalent to the detonation of an entire universe. Those two words are, I will. Think of the gravity of that. Until that cosmic moment, only God said, I am. That was the exclusive declaration of the Creator, the self-affirmation of the being who sustains himself, who depends on no one, who is the source of all existence. When Moses asked God what his name was in the episode of the burning bush, the answer was exactly that. I am who I am. And when Lucifer, in the silence of his own chest, began to formulate phrases starting with I will, he was trying, without clearly understanding the magnitude of what he was doing, to ape the declaration that only the Creator has the right to pronounce. He was not yet raising a flag of rebellion. He was just experimenting in internal whispers with phrases that prefigured a rebellion. I will be greater. I will be like the Most High. I will be recognized. I will be obeyed. 5 phrases beginning with I will would later form the skeleton of the fall, as Isaiah preserved. And each of those phrases, when it first arose within him, was accompanied by an ambiguous sensation. A part of his being, The part created to glorify shuddered with horror at formulating such phrases, because pure angelic nature does not accommodate these ideas. Every spiritual cell of his knew that was aberrant. But another part, the part that was already infected by retained glory, felt a strange and forbidden pleasure in pronouncing those phrases mentally. A pleasure that, for the first time in Lucifer's existence, was not directed toward God. It was a pleasure turned inward, a self-referential pleasure. And that pleasure, once tasted, created dependency. Just like a cosmic drug. The more he thought those phrases, the more the holy part within him weakened, and the more the corrupted part strengthened. Until one day, a day that no one marked on the calendar of heaven, but that was inscribed in the memory of God with absolute precision, the proportion inverted. The corrupted part became greater than the holy part. And from then on, Lucifer ceased to be the cherub of glory to become, still silently, the cherub of a stolen glory. But even at that point, notice, the rebellion had not yet become public. It was mature in the heart, but it had not yet manifested in acts. No one in heaven had noticed. The office continued to be fulfilled. The stones continued to shine. The choir continued to be conducted. Lucifer continued covering the throne, and God continued waiting. Because even after the internal inversion, there was still, in theory, the possibility of return. Until the last minute, the cherub could have fallen to his knees, shed angelic tears, confessed everything he had accumulated inside him, and asked for purification. And God, in his infinite mercy, would have forgiven. He would have restored him. He would have perhaps created a new beginning for that being. But pride, once established as the internal sovereign, closes all the doors of contrition. And Lucifer did not bend, he did not return, he did not ask. He just continued in a progressive hardening, preparing the day when the thought phrases would become spoken phrases and later visible acts in all of heaven. And while this was taking shape, the cosmic scenery prepared, without knowing it, the stage for the greatest drama ever enacted. The celestial choirs rehearsed songs that would soon be interrupted. The lower-ranking angels followed the instructions that came from Lucifer's hierarchy, without suspecting that those instructions were beginning to be subtly edited. The cherubim around the throne continued their sacred vigil. The seraphim cried out the triple holy. Nothing external announced the catastrophe, but in the innermost chambers of the highest being in heaven, a cosmic time bomb ticked second by second toward the moment of detonation. And it is here, exactly at this point, that the next phase of the story needs to be told with surgical attention. Because between the still hidden rebellion and the open rebellion, there is a very specific moment. A moment when Lucifer, for the first time, opened his mouth and articulated outward that which, until then, had only existed inside him. A moment when the first other being in the universe heard from Lucifer something that was no longer pure worship. A moment when the cherub's communication ceased to be only vertical, between him and God, and became horizontal, beginning to reach other angels with new content, ambiguous content. Content that suggested, in a still, soft tone, that perhaps heaven could be organized in another way, that perhaps the cherub's office deserved more recognition, that perhaps the glory distributed in the cosmos could follow a different architecture than the one God himself had established. And when that first conversation happened, that first lateral sowing of rebellion, the entire universe, without knowing it, was touched by a cold wind. A wind that the angels did not yet know how to name. A slight suspicion, a slight restlessness, something like a cold breath passing between the columns of the celestial temple. And 1/3 of the angels, as Revelation 12 would later reveal, would begin to be gradually captured by that breath. Not all at once, little by little, one here, another there, conversation by conversation, insinuation by insinuation, suggestion by suggestion, until Lucifer, without ever needing to declare open war, had built a parallel current of loyalties within heaven itself. And here is the detail that makes this phase so devastatingly dangerous. Lucifer did not need to lie openly to capture those other angels. He did not say, at any initial moment, "God is a tyrant," or "let's overthrow the throne." If he had said that, any sane angel would have recoiled in horror. What he did was much more sophisticated. He introduced questions. He planted doubts wrapped in the form of reflection. Have you ever stopped to think why the hierarchy is exactly like this? Have you ever wondered why we always sing the same words? Don't you find it curious that there are so many of us and only one receives all the glory? Each of these questions in isolation seemed innocent. It was just a reflection. It was just intellectual curiosity. But each question was a seed. And seeds planted in angelic soils, fertile soils, created to produce worship, germinate with impressive speed, even when what was planted there is poison disguised as philosophy. And the angels who heard those questions for the first time felt something similar to what Lucifer had felt in the first moments of his own fall. A slight restlessness, a discomfort they could not name, a feeling that they were being invited to think things they had never thought. And for many of them, this novelty was irresistible, because thought, once open to the possibility of doubt, rarely returns alone to the simplicity of faith. The serpent that Lucifer would later become in the garden was already rehearsing in heaven the method he would use with Eve. Did God really say? That question, which would echo millennia later under the canopy of a tree, was originally formulated in the celestial corridors, directed at other angels even before being directed at the first woman. Lucifer was perfecting in the laboratory of heaven the technique he would later apply on a human scale. And God once again observed everything, every conversation, every planted question, every angel that yielded even a millimeter to the insinuated doubt. God saw how the poison spread from cherub to cherub, from principality to principality, slowly descending through the hierarchies and reaching even lower-ranking angels who would never have imagined on their own initiative, questioning a single comma of the celestial order. And yet, God allowed it. He allowed it because free will is only real if it can be used wrongly. He allowed it because the love God wants is not the love of robotized creatures, but of beings who choose to love, even having the option not to love. He allowed it because, in the final analysis, this drama needed to unfold to the end so that the entire universe would understand forever what happens when a creature tries to be more than it was made to be. And while the subterranean current grew, some angels resisted. Michael, the warrior archangel, felt something wrong long before it became obvious. He noticed subtle changes in the tone of his brother cherub. He noticed songs that no longer fit perfectly into the general chord. He noticed looks that lasted a moment longer than necessary on his own reflection. Michael said nothing publicly, because it was not the time, and because the order of heaven required a wisdom much greater than a hasty denunciation. But Michael observed. Gabriel, for his part, felt an inexplicable sadness when he was near Lucifer in those final days, as if the very air around the anointed cherub had changed temperature, as if a shadow, still invisible, was already beginning to form on the back of the one who before radiated only light. The holy angels sensed it, not with intellectual clarity, but with that acute spiritual perception that holy beings possess when something deeply wrong is gestating near them. And here, before reaching the exact moment of the open rupture, a moment that belongs to another story, the story of the fall itself, we need to stop and absorb what this pre-fall phase means. Because everything that has been narrated so far happened before the first cry of rebellion, before the first angelic sword was unsheathed, before heaven publicly divided. before Revelation 12 had anything to record. All this slow corruption, all this incubation process, all this silent fermentation of pride, it all happened while, on the outside, Lucifer still looked like the anointed cherub, perfect in his ways, covered in precious stones, walking in the midst of the fire of the throne. And this is one of the most disturbing truths that Scripture gives us about the nature of evil. Evil is not born ready. Evil develops. Evil grows within the creature like an invisible tumor that, for a long time, produces no external symptoms, and when the symptoms finally appear, the tumor is already in an advanced stage, and surgery has become impossible because the creature no longer wants to be operated on. Think now, with honesty, how this mirrors your own life, how this mirrors the life of each of us. How many times have you allowed small and seemingly neutral thoughts to settle inside your mind? How many times have you found yourself admiring yourself a little too much in the mirror of your own success? How many times have you compared your trajectory with that of other people and felt, deep in your chest, that silent flash of superiority or envy? Each of those moments is, on a microscopic scale, a reenactment of what happened in Lucifer's chest. The difference is not in the nature of the impulse, it is in the scale at which it manifests. And that is why this story, although it takes place in a cosmic setting inhabited by beings we have never personally known, is the most intimate, personal, and relevant story that can be told about the human heart. Because pride does not choose victims. Pride does not distinguish creatures. Pride does not respect positions, has no reverence for hierarchies, and is not intimidated by precious stones or university degrees. Pride attacks the cherub on the mountain of God with the same ease with which it attacks the young professional in a big city office. It attacks the celebrity applauded by millions, and it attacks the anonymous family man who got a promotion. It attacks the recognized pastor, and it attacks the new believer who just learned 3 verses. Wherever there is a creature, there will be the possibility of pride. And wherever there is the possibility of pride, there will be the possibility of a fall. Not a cosmic fall like Lucifer's, because none of us occupies the position he occupied, but personal, internal, silent falls that destroy marriages, ministries, friendships, and entire vocations. And here is the deepest lesson this narrative gives us. Lucifer did not fall for lack of knowledge. He had perfect wisdom. Lucifer did not fall for lack of beauty. He was beauty incarnate. Lucifer did not fall for lack of proximity to God. He walked in the midst of the stones of fire. Lucifer fell because at some point in his glorious existence, he stopped returning to God what belonged to God. And this constant return, this continuous surrender of all glory received back to the source that originated it, is the only antidote that exists against the fall. There is no other. Not apparent holiness, not spectacular gifts, not elevated positions, not a history of past obedience. None of that protects a creature. The only protection is the continued act, moment by moment, of recognizing that all we are is a gift, and that the only appropriate response to a gift is gratitude returned to the giver. Therefore, when you read Ezekiel 28 or Isaiah 14 from now on, do not read those texts as descriptions of a distant enemy. Read them as mirrors. Read them as warnings written with cosmic ink for any creature that has the minimum of consciousness. Every time those passages describe the pride of the cherub, they also describe the latent tendency that exists within you. Every time they mention the heart that was lifted up, they also mention that moment, perhaps this week, when you felt superior to someone. Every time they speak of corrupted internal commerce, they also speak of the silent transactions that happen in your mind when you decide to keep for yourself a compliment that should have been returned to God. This is the practical purpose of these passages. They were not written to feed curiosity about demonology. They were written to give us a diagnosis of what can happen to any of us if we lower our guard of humility and see the paradoxical beauty of all this. Lucifer fell by wanting to be like the Most High. He tried to achieve by force what he could never conquer by force. But what Lucifer did not understand, and what many of us also do not understand, is that there is a real way to become like the Most High. That way does not go through exaltation, it goes through emptying. It does not go through conquest, it goes through surrender. It does not go through I will, it goes through let it be done to me. This was exactly the path that Christ demonstrated when, being in the form of God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Lucifer wanted to go up and went down. Christ went down and went up. And in this profound inversion lies the entire key to spiritual existence. He who exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Lucifer's story before the fall is the first great chapter of this cosmic law, the tragic chapter that needs to be known so that the glorious chapter, written later by Christ, makes complete sense. Therefore, as you finish this journey through the pre-fall chambers of the most beautiful of angels, take with you a single conviction. It is not the position that protects a soul. It is not beauty. It is not the gift. It is not the function. It is not the history of past faithfulness. What protects a soul is the knee bent in real time. It is the heart that with every breath returns to the Creator the glory it receives. It is the silent refusal 1,000 times a day to consider oneself greater than one is. It is constant vigilance against that first thought, seemingly innocent, that whispers inside you, I am really something very special. That thought, left loose, grows. It grows until it becomes a highway. And no creature, no matter how high, is above this law. And perhaps that is the reason why God allowed the account of Lucifer's fall to be preserved in the scriptures with so many details, so that we would never forget where sin is born, so that we would never underestimate the subtlety with which it infiltrates, so that we would never imagine we are immune just because, at the moment, everything seems to be going well. Lucifer's story before the fall is a dark gift God left us, a warning painted with the richest colors the universe has ever seen, precisely so we could not ignore it. And every time this story is told, it fulfills its function. It warns again, it warns once more, because as long as there are creatures with free will walking this world, there will be a need to remember how the most beautiful of all beings managed, in the silence of his own chest, to transform himself into the one who would be called the adversary. May this story be engraved in you. May it visit you in moments of success, when the applause is too loud and the heart begins to swell. May it visit you in moments of comparison, when you find yourself looking at another person and feeling that strange pull to measure yourself against them. May it visit you in moments of spiritual solitude, when the temptation is to interpret that solitude as proof of your own uniqueness. In each of those moments, remember Lucifer. Remember the 9 stones. Remember the throne he covered. Remember the stones of fire where he walked. And remember how, even surrounded by so much glory, he fell, because he allowed a single thought to go without being surrendered to God. If it happened to him, it can happen to anyone. And the only real defense now and forever is uninterrupted humility before the one who is the source of all beauty, all wisdom, and all existence. If you have made it this far, click on the next video that is appearing on your screen now. I have selected it especially for those who watch this one until the end.